In between watching a lot of movies, I play some games, so I thought, why not review one? Bioshock is part of my journey back onto the Xbox 360. Bioshock is a new purchase, and it's one of those games that reminds me that even though a game may look outdated, it's not necessarily bad as well. The gameplay is still solid and almost bugless, the story won't ever be outdated, and overall, Bioshock is just a brilliant game. The story of Bioshock is what attracts most fans. More than that, the overarching themes of the game are what attracts fans. What I took away from the game was some very serious musings on video games in general. More specifically, the story of the game, especially towards the end, made me question my justification for following the game's instructions. Obviously because I have no choice if I want to finish the game, but more than that, what struck me was that I'd never even thought about what I was doing. Previously, the only games to make me think about my actions were the Hotline Miami games, but Bioshock does it much more subtly. The game's linear narrative incorporates elements of RPG very skillfully, and I think that might be why I felt like at the end of the game I had been making my own decisions, despite very clearly never having done so. Bioshock is a first-person shooter at heart, but the game very cleverly incorporates non-linear level design into its linear story to encourage a certain level of exploration. Not just for ammo, but for interesting notes about the world of Bioshock and the city of Rapture. I found myself much more interested in the backstory and the expositional elements of Bioshock's narrative than the linear narrative that drove the events of the game. Of course, the backstory helps drive the surface-level plot of Bioshock, but exploring the levels of the game for Diaries gave so much extra context to what I was doing as the main character. I think it plays really well into the endgame reveal. It's difficult to explain how without spoiling anything, but the use of diaries to help the player justify their own actions is part of what I think makes the end of the game so impactful. The other thing that surprises me about the game, and something that makes it a little bit harder, is what happens when you die. It's not just a simple respawn to checkpoint. Instead, you spawn at the closest medical tank with exactly the same items as when you died. So in some sense, this is a great decision because it adds a little extra punch to the more difficult situations. You can't just die and try again because the enemy that killed you is still going to be there. The tension that comes from knowing that no matter what you do, you have to keep grinding away until you make it through is quite claustrophobic and kind of terrifying. It adds extra weight to death, and it makes you want to conserve items. Specific to my playthrough, I felt like I was trying to develop tactics for each enemy to try and get through them with the least amount of resources, which often involved the incinerate plasmid and the shotgun, but for something like a Big Daddy, I found myself developing a way to get through them and come out the other end with at least one health pack. And the same goes for all of the more difficult enemies throughout Rapture. The problem that's attached to this, however, is the occasional endless loop of wrench bashing. Near the beginning of the game, I hadn't quite gotten a handle on the necessity of exploring and using ammo correctly. The result of this was running out of ammo, health packs, and Eve, and being constantly slaughtered by a Big Daddy. So because the game doesn't reset when you die, I had to continuously run from the medical tank to the Big Daddy, bash him twice with my wrench until I died, and then repeat until I eventually defeated him. The actual process of fighting enemies is pretty solid for a game released in 2007. Switching between plasmids and weapons was simple and quick enough that they could be used in conjunction with each other for almost any situation. Switching from the electronic plasmid to a wrench or another predetermined weapon is very simple and makes combat situations easy to adapt to with the right amount of skill. But in addition to this, the plasmids themselves are fairly well designed in that they mostly aren't for damage, they're for tactics. Most plasmids don't do damage. Case in point, the electronic plasmid I mentioned before. Using this plasmid on enemies, and more specifically robot enemies, stuns them and for robots reboots them. So in that sense, the electronic plasmid is more effective for robotic enemies than it is for splicers and other humanoid enemies. On the other side of this coin, the incinerate plasmid, one of the few plasmids that does do damage, does more damage to a humanoid enemy than to a robotic one. Because of the effects that different plasmids have, they become very tactical parts of your inventory, and that's really cool. This kind of tactical resource is also a part of the different types of weapon ammo. Each weapon has 3 different types of ammo, and that's another aspect of the game that encourages tactical gameplay, something that most first-person shooters struggle to do effectively. The atmosphere of the game is also incredible. Bioshock is incredibly eerie and tense. Like, tense enough for me to fire grenades at my feet out of shock. The level design and overall aesthetic of the game is brilliantly combined with the sound mix to create a truly terrifying atmosphere. The splices are designed in a truly grotesque and terrifying manner. The atom that people use throughout the game is supposed to only modify your genes a little tiny bit, and seeing what it's like at the most extreme level is scary. The debris that lies around the game's levels gave off a sense of what things used to be like. The often futuristic architecture is broken down and damaged, leading to many bright lights and walls strewn across the ground, forming strange shadow patterns. Everything is laid out in a seemingly random fashion, adding a sense of unease to the environment. The winding hallways and hidden doors make the game's exploration much more difficult and often lands you in new environments with any number of enemies lying around the corner. It's often very difficult to locate things without aid, and the sound mix doesn't help. I played quite a bit of this game with headphones, and for most games, headphones make it much easier to locate enemies because of the stereo sound mix. Not the case for Bioshock. The voices and screams of splicers and the rumbles of Big Daddies does not help you locate either of these things. The sounds don't come from one direction or the other, they only fill your ears, letting you know something is nearby. It doesn't help that something like a spider splicer walks backward on the ceiling. Enemies can come from any direction, up, down, left, or right, and being unable to locate them when you can hear them is terrifying. Being a game made in 2007, the game is surprisingly close to bugless, and it looks really good. I personally think that the revenge plot near the end of the game is a little tacked on, but from what I've seen, I'm in the minority on that, and regardless, it was still a fun section of the game. And that's really the only criticism that I can think of for Bioshock. Other than that, I think it's a pretty much flawless game.
Bioshock? 10 out of 10.